The chances are that you're reading this on a laptop. If so, you're sitting at the end of a long and winding global supply chain. The typical computer might contain a memory chip from Malaysia, a battery from Indonesia, a screen from South Korea, RAM from Germany, and a hard drive made in Thailand. This all before it was assembled in China and then bought off your shelf wherever you may be. That is the reality of global supply chains. A major firm will design and sell you a product, but its contents will be built and assembled by multiple suppliers all over the world, each sourcing from another lower down the chain. Nowadays, there's a lot of talk about modern slavery and about forced labour in supply chains, and it is the case that many workers are exploited in them. But the question is, why? The media, politicians, and businesses will often tell you that it's simply a case of bad apples, bad guys wanting to do bad things to innocent people. But that isn't enough. There are fundamental systems and structures in place which ensure that exploitation happens. These ensure, on the one hand, a supply of workers who are vulnerable enough to be exploited, and on the other, a demand on the part of businesses for their exploitable labour. What are those structures? We argue that there are 8. On the supply side, there are 4 which together work to create this pool of workers who don't really have any better alternative than to accept very exploitative work. These people lack what we call freedom as the power to say no, in that if they say no to exploitative work, life will be even worse for them, so they don't really have the actionable freedom to resist this kind of exploitation. The first of those 4 factors is poverty. Now I want to be clear that I am not talking about poverty as some abstract entity, as this thing that exists in the world or that pertains to particular people. Poverty is a term that we use to describe the fact that some people don't have many resources. They may not have many rights. They do not have control over the material or legal means to ensure a decent life for themselves. And that fact is relational. The fact that some people are poor is the other side of the coin, whereby some people are very, very rich. So poverty isn't just this abstract thing. It is a very real social relation. But what it means in the case of supply chains is that those who are poor, who lack control over the money they need to lead decent lives, these people are more vulnerable to exploitation because they are less able to say no to that exploitation. Sometimes the best jobs available for them are bad jobs at the very foot of global supply chains. Another key structural factor is discrimination. Now, many people will tell you that modern slavery is colorblind, that exploitation in supply chains, it doesn't discriminate. Anyone is equally vulnerable. This is not true. We know from the research that women are more likely to be exploited than men, and those who are non-white are more likely to be exploited than white people. This is because of social systems of discrimination, of social categorization that construct some people as lesser than others, and therefore more available for exploitation, and therefore more available to be paid lower wages, for example, less likely to achieve better or decent work within global supply chains. So discrimination matters critically for understanding severe exploitation in global business. A third structural factor is the lack of labour protection. Think of inspectors, for example, that go into a workplace and are there to ensure that the employer is respecting his or her workers. These inspectors are almost non-existent in the vast majority of countries, and over the last decades they have been reduced drastically in numbers. At the same time, labour law has had much of the bite taken out of it in many countries. So ultimately what we have here is a situation in which workers across the world are lacking legal protection, either on the books in terms of the laws that are written down or in terms of enforcement in the global economy. And this lack of labour protection opens up spaces in which people are more likely to be exploited. The final factor that creates this supply of workers who are exploitable are migration regimes. Migrants who are moving for a better life, to access better work opportunities, or whichever factor it may be that has taken them overseas, they are more likely to end up in exploitation and more likely to end up in exploitative work relations at the foot of supply chains because, as migrants, they lack the rights that citizens have. So someone who has moved, for example, from South Africa to the United Kingdom, particularly if they may have done so illegally, will find themselves outside of the zone of legal protection and therefore more likely to have to accept very exploitative working relations. These migration regimes determine who is entitled to which rights and who is entitled to none, and they therefore provide this flow, if you like, of workers who are vulnerable enough to be exploited in global supply chains. Now, on the other side, we also have the demand factors, if you like, which create pressure within the global market for exploitative work or open up spaces where these workers can be exploited. These are factors that operate, if you like, on the business side of the equation, whereas the supply gave us this group of workers, this category of workers able to be exploited. The other side is the business pressure, if you will, to exploit these workers and the business practices that ensure that these workers are exploited. The first of these structural factors that we identify as of critical importance is the concentration of corporate power and ownership. Global businesses are now massive and they are bigger and more powerful than ever. Walmart, for example, brought in almost $500 billion in sales revenue this year, which is 35 times the national revenue of a country like Jamaica. These corporations are now so powerful that they are able to gobble up an ever bigger slice of the pie, which leaves less for the folks supplying them lower down the supply chain. In cocoa, for example, we know from research conducted by scholars at the Institute of Development Studies that cocoa farmers in Ghana receive just 4% of the final price of an average UK bar of milk chocolate, with the lion's share of that going to the chocolate manufacturers and the retailers. And the less that the top firms pay, the more the smaller players have to fight over what's left, and this sometimes leads to serious exploitation. Another factor, also relating to the power and the size of the biggest firms, is how they then go on to treat their suppliers. Changing orders at late notice, demanding delivery at extreme speed, delaying or refusing payment. These are the things that huge global firms can do because they have the power to do so. And when they do so, they put pressure on the smaller firms that supply them to exploit their workers, just in order to make ends meet. A third factor related to this is outsourcing. As I mentioned, big global brands no longer really make the things that they sell. Instead, they get other firms in other countries to do it for them. In turn, these firms outsource to further firms ever lower down the supply chain and ever more under the radar of legal protection. This practice means that the people selling the goods at the top of the chain don't have legal responsibility for those who make the goods at the bottom of the chain, nor do they oversee to ensure that workers are being treated well. So the more outsourcing there is, the more chance there is of exploitative work happening. You may, however, have heard of things like company auditing or corporate social responsibility, businesses saying that they check their supply chains to make sure that no one is being exploited. The thing is, though, that research shows that these things don't really work very well. It's like asking the lion to look after the gazelle. So the final factor here is that under pressure from major corporations and their allies in the government, there has been a massive lack of legal regulation of global supply chains and of policing to ensure that suppliers are respecting the rights of workers. People coming in to inspect and to check that employers are doing the right thing, laws that punish corporations for doing the wrong thing. This stuff is absent, and what it means is that exploitation can take place without oversight. Those, therefore, are some of the root causes of exploitation of forced labour in supply chains. And next week, we'll be looking at some of the things we can do about them. Enjoy.